The fluorescent lights hummed with a thin insect sound as I pushed my cleaning cart down the 50th floor corridor of Grant Tower. The rain outside needling the glass with a relentless patience that made the whole building feel like a sealed aquarium. At 3 in the morning, the prestige offices were empty of their daytime owners, the wealthy managers and careful strategists who moved through these hallways in expensive silence and never looked at the woman who changed their trash liners. I liked this hour because the world did not press back. The elevators dozed. The city blinked far below. My hands remembered the motions while my mind drifted toward arithmetic I could not change. Rent due on the 1st, tuition due on Friday, the shape of a week that did not have enough edges to hold the weight of either. My name tag read Emma Carter. The plastic swung each time I reached for a spray bottle, click tapping against my chest like a tiny metronome for every breath. I wiped carefully around framed photographs that showed men in dark suits shaking hands with a mayor, a senator, a foreign investor, smiles never reaching their eyes. A heatless ache walked up the ladder of my spine. 32 and working 2 jobs, the night one here and a weekend one at a diner, because life does not pause when a factory burns. It simply redraws your obligations in black marker and tells you to run. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I should have ignored it. The floor supervisor hated phones, and I hated the feeling of hope that always arrived with a vibration. I glanced anyway. I need $800 for tuition by Friday, or they will drop my classes. The text was simple, exact, like a bill stamped with a deadline in red ink. My brother did not add a pleading face or a string of apologies. He did not have to. I could see him at a wobbly campus table with a coffee going cold, reading a chapter about circuits and building a life he had promised me would pay back everything. 800 might as well have been 8 million, with 12 hours left in my pay period. I closed my eyes for a count of 3. Then I drew the cloth in a clean square over the wood and told myself that the only way out was through. Ray Johnson, the night security guard, came around the corner with his round of keys and a thermos that smelled like cinnamon. He had kind eyes that crinkled when he called me Miss Carter in a mock formal voice like we were co-hosts of a charity gala. "You are the hardest worker in this tower," he said, voice low so it would not carry. "Half these suits could not survive your shift." I smiled because the kindness made the floor feel less cold, and because a compliment sometimes functions as fuel when food does not. After he vanished down the corridor, the quiet grew wide again, a canvas for the thoughts I refused to paint. I stacked them like folded linens in the back of my mind and pushed my cart toward the executive floor. The elevator ding felt too loud in the hush. This level was usually off limits to the night crew, a rumor wrapped in wood paneling and polished steel. Tonight it belonged to me because someone called in sick and a supervisor penciled my name into a slot as if it were a harmless substitution. The carpet gave under my shoes with a thick grace of money. Art glowed on the walls like captive suns. I moved through it all with a small, careful posture, the way one moves in a church when one does not believe but still respects the architecture. Halfway through dusting a reception desk large enough to land a helicopter, I heard voices from the far corner office. The plate on the double doors read Alexander Grant, and the letters seemed to have their own gravity. One voice pleaded with an adult fear that sounds like a child crying in a locked room. The other voice did not raise itself to be heard, it simply existed in a space that obeyed it. I told myself to back away. There are moments when the right choice is to choose not to know. But my feet carried me forward as if the carpet had become a conveyor belt and my body a parcel with the wrong address. The door was not closed. It had been left a thumb's width open. Through that seam, I saw a man tied to a chair, his face mapped with purple fear and the stubborn sheen of sweat, and standing before him a figure cut clean from a catalog of power. Tall, immaculate suit despite the hour, hair combed like a decision, jawline sharp and impersonal. He was younger than I had expected, and the pale gray of his eyes made me think of winter light. I knew without a second of doubt that I was looking at Alexander Grant. "Please, Mr. Grant," the man in the chair said, and his voice broke on the title. I did not know they were at the docks. "I am loyal." He tried to lift his bound hands as if the gesture itself might add truth. The man in the suit reached into a drawer and drew out a silenced pistol the way another man might retrieve a pen. Without drama, without hurry, without apology. The sound that followed was not the cinematic crack a person hears in crowded theaters. It was a small, thick thud that rewrote the air. My breath seized. The spray bottle in my hand fell and struck the marble threshold with a clatter that rang like a bell at the wrong altar. For one suspended second, no one moved. Then the mountain of a man near the window turned, and his eyes found the crack, and then me. Alexander Grant looked up as well. Our gazes crossed like crossed wires. Something sparked. I ran. My heart knocked at the inside of my ribs so hard I half expected it to bruise through. I slammed the stairwell bar and went down 2 steps at a time, cart abandoned somewhere behind me with its quiet domesticity of rags and brushes and an empty coffee cup. The stairwell smelled of metal and cleaner and the stubborn ghost of old smoke. I reached the service level and leaned into the cold concrete wall, palms pressed to my face. Do not be a name he remembers, I told myself. Be a blur and a badge number, be a hallway no one writes down. The next evening, I arrived early out of a fear that expressed itself as obedience. My hands shook so hard I had to swipe my access card twice. I told myself I would ask the supervisor to reassign me. I told myself I would make my mouth say the words. Instead, when the clipboard came down the line, my assignment had already been written in a neat square of ink, executive floor. The elevator ride up felt like a slow entombment. Lights blinked their count from lobby to heaven. The doors opened on a stillness that felt arranged. His office door stood wide this time. An invitation or a verdict. He sat behind the desk with a calm that looked almost gentle until one noticed the exactness of his posture and the clean geometry of his hands. The suit was darker tonight, the tie sober, the eyes very awake. He gestured once. I stepped inside because I did not know how not to. Emma Carter, he said, as if reading it from somewhere over my shoulder. 32. Evening shifts, weekend shifts, daytime classes in accounting that you have not finished because you chose to finish someone else first. Noah Carter, 2nd year, good grades, $800 due. The way he said my brother's name was not cruel, but it was absolute. He slid a folder across the desk. I did not look down. Paper has a way of confessing what you wish to deny. I am turning in my notice, I heard myself say, and the words felt like pennies tossed into a canyon. I do not know what I saw. I do not care, I will not speak of it. Let me go and you will never have to see me again. Courage and desperation sometimes sound the same from a distance. Up close, they taste different. He studied me the way I have seen surgeons study X-rays, searching for the line that will open and not kill. You are not going anywhere, he said, and the sentence did not carry a threat so much as an inventory. He told me my address and my class schedule. He told me the coffee shop where Noah liked to study at this hour and the color of his sweatshirt. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The room did it for him. A cold clarity moved through me, and I understood the shape of the cage I had walked into. This is a promotion, he said finally, as if announcing a policy change to a board. You will maintain my penthouse. Different access, different compensation. He pushed a small card toward me. It looked harmless, a rectangle of plastic with a strip of code. My breath had steadied without my permission. The knot in my stomach had not. I took the card because there was no other object to take that would not be worse. I wanted to despise him. I managed instead to hate the arithmetic of hunger and love that had brought me to his desk. When I left the office, the hall camera followed me with its blinking red eye. The window at the end of the corridor showed a city smeared by rain. Somewhere in that brightness, my brother bent over a book, building a life with stubborn hands. I pressed the new card into my palm until it left a small rectangle of pain, a neat little proof that I was awake. Then I pushed my cart forward, one wheel squeaking a thin, steady note, and the tower swallowed the sound like it had swallowed every confession I had ever whispered to it at 3 a.m. The next morning came without sunlight. The sky above the city wore the color of wet metal, and the streets below the bus windows gleamed like bruised skin. I sat hunched in the corner seat, my uniform folded inside my bag so the smell of disinfectant would not follow me into the daylight. Each stop brought more commuters with their paper cups and unread faces, all of us moving in separate directions while pretending we had chosen the same life. My thoughts circled the conversation from the night before until the sound of it seemed carved into the inside of my skull. You are not going anywhere. The words were clean, final, and impossible to erase. When I reached my apartment, Noah was still asleep on the couch, one arm hanging over the edge, textbooks scattered like fallen leaves across the carpet. He had stayed up late again studying, the television still glowing with a muted late-night news anchor mouthing headlines about markets and crime. His face, even in sleep, carried the kind of exhaustion that belonged to people who believed too much. I stood there for a moment, watching him breathe, and wondered what he would say if he knew what his tuition had already cost me. The refrigerator hummed weakly when I opened it. Half a carton of milk, a few eggs, and a takeout container of noodles that had turned the color of old paper. I poured a glass of water instead and stared out the kitchen window toward the gray skyline. Somewhere in one of those towers sat Alexander Grant, the man whose name could make security guards stand straighter and bankers lower their voices. I had seen him erase a life with a motion as casual as signing a contract, and now he owned the remainder of mine. By evening, I was back in my uniform, my hair twisted into the same tight bun that marked me as invisible. My supervisor handed me a new badge with the word Penthouse stamped in silver. She smiled, half envy and half disbelief. Promotion, huh? I guess Mr. Grant noticed your work. I forced a polite laugh. If only she knew. The private elevator required a fingerprint scan before it would move. My reflection in the mirrored wall looked like someone else's life. The uniform too clean, the eyes too alert. As the car rose, I counted floors by their silence. The doors opened onto a world that smelled faintly of cedar and expensive restraint. The penthouse stretched out like a museum, white marble floors, black glass tables, art that seemed to hum with price tags I could not imagine. Alexander Grant stood near the window, phone pressed to his ear. He did not glance at me immediately, but his presence filled the room like a low frequency you could feel in your ribs. He ended the call without goodbye and turned, those pale gray eyes pinning me as neatly as a butterfly under glass. You are early, he said. I thought it was best to arrive before anyone else. My voice felt too loud in the quiet. Punctuality is good. He moved toward the bar, poured something clear into a glass, and gestured toward the corridor. Your supplies are there. You will keep this place exactly as you find it. Nothing moved, nothing missing. You will work when I am here and when I am not. Understood? I nodded, though the words landed like invisible chains. He handed me a small envelope. Inside was a new contract printed on thick paper, my name written in the careful script of his assistant. The salary listed made my pulse jump. It was enough to pay Noah's tuition for a semester, maybe two. I looked up. Why me? I asked before I could stop myself. He considered me for a long moment. Because you are discreet, he said finally. And because I prefer to keep what I cannot control where I can see it. The honesty of it stole my breath. He turned away again, dismissing me with a movement of his hand. I began to clean because motion was safer than thought. Every surface reflected fragments of my face. The silence of the place pressed against my skin. In the far corner of the living area stood a grand piano, its lid closed like a secret. A photograph rested on the side table beside it, a woman with dark hair holding a child who had Alexander's eyes. I looked away quickly. Hours passed, measured by the soft rhythm of cloth on glass. At one point, he walked through the room, coat slung over his shoulder, phone still in hand. You have a brother, he said, not as a question, but as a statement that contained more than it should. Yes. He is studying engineering? I hesitated, then nodded. Second year. Good field. The world will always need someone who understands structure. His gaze flicked toward me. Unreadable. Keep your phone on tonight, in case I need you to stay late. The elevator doors closed behind him with a whisper. Only then did I realize how deeply I had been holding my breath. The silence he left behind was not relief. It was residue. By midnight, I finished polishing the last table and stood at the window. The city pulsed below, endless grids of light blinking through the mist. From this height, everything looked clean, precise, controlled. I pressed my palm to the glass, half expecting to feel warmth from the lights beneath. There was nothing but cold. On the ride down, I watched the floor numbers count backward toward the world where people like me existed. When the doors opened onto the empty lobby, Ray Johnson was waiting by the security desk. "You survived the upper floors," he joked, then caught the look on my face. "Hey, you okay?" "I am fine," I said automatically. He studied me for a second too long, but let it drop. Outside, the rain had returned, softer this time, like an apology. I walked toward the bus stop, the badge for the penthouse heavy in my pocket. The street smelled of wet asphalt and exhaust. Somewhere a siren wailed, high and thin. I thought about Noah, about the rent, about the man in the chair whose name I never learned. Every decision in my life had been about survival. This one was no different. When I reached home, Noah was at the table with a stack of notes and a tired smile. "They reinstated my classes," he said. "I made the payment this afternoon. Did you get more hours?" "Something like that," I said, hanging my coat. His relief was so bright it hurt to look at. He talked about professors and deadlines, his voice filling the room with a future I wanted to believe in. I nodded at the right places, pretending not to feel the invisible eyes that already watched us from somewhere high above the city. Later, lying awake, I replayed Alexander Grant's words. "I prefer to keep what I cannot control where I can see it." The phrase curled around me like smoke. I understood then that this was not a job. It was a containment. And I was the variable he had decided to manage. Yet beneath the fear, there was something else. A pull I could not name. A curiosity that lived where reason should have been. I closed my eyes and saw the reflection of those winter gray eyes in the glass, steady, calculating, and unbearably human. The rain drummed on the window until it blurred into a single endless note. I told myself I could endure this for Noah's sake, that I could remain unseen even under his gaze. But somewhere deep inside, a voice I did not recognize whispered the truth. Once you are noticed by a man like Alexander Grant, you never become invisible again. The penthouse became its own universe, one that floated far above the city and its noise. I entered each night through a private elevator that opened directly into silence. No voices, no footsteps but mine, just the muted hum of ventilation and the soft echo of my shoes on polished stone. The space was larger than any home I had known, 2 floors of glass, marble, and shadow. Every object looked as if it had been chosen for a photograph rather than for a life. The windows stretched from floor to ceiling, revealing a skyline that looked almost unreal, like the city was something drawn rather than lived in. My first week there passed like a fever dream. I learned the rhythm of the place, the sequence of rooms, the sound the piano made when the air conditioning shifted. I cleaned the same surfaces every night, even when they were spotless, afraid to leave a fingerprint that might look like a question. I never saw anyone but Alexander Grant and the occasional guard in a black suit who lingered by the elevator with a professional blankness. Alexander spent his evenings at the desk in his office, working under a single lamp that turned his hair silver at the edges. He rarely spoke. When he did, his words were as precise as the pen strokes he made on the pages before him. I was aware of his gaze even when I pretended not to notice. It was not crude or lingering, it was clinical, assessing, like he was studying the equation of my presence in his world. Sometimes I caught fragments of his phone calls. The words were careful, too careful terms like shipments, clients overseas, new arrangements. He never mentioned anything illegal, but every sentence was built like a wall to keep truth behind it. I began to understand what kind of man could order a killing and then return to reviewing financial reports as if nothing had happened. Despite the fear, there was a strange calm to the routine. My body adjusted to the rhythm of his world. Enter at 8, clean until midnight, leave by 1. He never dismissed me directly. I simply learned when to disappear. The pay arrived in my account every Friday, double what I had ever earned before. The money meant Noah could focus on his classes, meant our bills were paid on time, meant the constant tension in my stomach began to loosen. But with that relief came another weight, the understanding that I was bound to this man's world by necessity, and necessity has its own brand of captivity. One night I found myself pausing by the piano. It was black and gleaming, untouched, as if even sound had been forbidden from disturbing the order of the room. A faint layer of dust marked the keys. I hesitated before wiping it away. Under the dim light, I noticed a small object resting beneath the piano bench. A child's toy car, red paint chipped on one side. It looked out of place among the art and glass, like a secret left behind. I slipped it onto the bench and finished cleaning without touching it again. Around midnight, Alexander appeared from the hallway, jacket off, shirt sleeves rolled up, a faint shadow of exhaustion darkening his features. He paused when he saw me by the piano. "You found it," he said quietly. I straightened, unsure if I should answer. It was under the bench. His eyes shifted to the toy car, and something unguarded flickered there, grief, or maybe memory. "It belonged to my nephew," he said finally. "He used to play here before." The sentence trailed off. He turned away before I could respond. "That will be all for tonight." I watched him disappear into his office and felt something unexpected tighten in my chest. The monster I had feared had just spoken like a man who once had a family. I gathered my supplies and left without another word. Days blurred into nights. The penthouse began to feel less like a workplace and more like a maze that rearranged itself while I was not looking. Sometimes, as I cleaned, I caught my reflection in the glass, small, ordinary, surrounded by luxury that did not belong to me. Yet the longer I stayed, the less the space felt hostile. It was still cold, but the cold had a pattern, one I could navigate. Then, one evening, something shifted. As I entered, the elevator opened to a low conversation near the bar. Two men in tailored suits stood with Alexander, their voices low and tense. I tried to retreat, but his gaze caught me immediately. "Continue with your work, Miss Carter," he said, his tone even. "We are almost finished." I moved through the living room, pretending to polish the glass table while my ears picked up fragments. The words were sharp: ports, territory, Kingston. One of the men spoke with the quick arrogance of someone used to being obeyed. Alexander's replies were colder, smoother, ending every sentence with finality. When they left, the silence snapped back into place. He remained standing by the window, hands clasped behind his back. "You should not have been here during that meeting," he said without turning. "I did not intend to listen," I said softly. "I know, but in this building, even silence has consequences." I wanted to ask what that meant, but his tone told me not to. Instead, I said, "You pay me to clean, not to understand." That made him turn. His expression held something almost like amusement. "That is true, but I find that understanding is what keeps most people alive." He walked past me then, close enough that I caught the faint scent of his cologne, something sharp and restrained. My heart stuttered, an involuntary reaction I despised. He paused near the door. "Be careful, Miss Carter. Curiosity can be mistaken for interest, and interest is dangerous." After he left, I sat for a moment on the edge of the couch, my hands trembling. He had spoken like a warning, but beneath it there was something else, something that felt almost like recognition. That night, as I rode the bus home, the city looked different. Every building seemed to hold its breath. Every light flickered with intention. I thought of the toy car under the piano, of the conversation about ports and territory, of his words about curiosity. The air outside smelled like rain again. At home, Noah was asleep at his desk, papers spread everywhere. I brushed a hand through his hair and whispered that we were going to be fine. But as I looked out the window toward the faint outline of Grant Tower in the distance, I realized I no longer believed in fine. There was only survival, and survival had a new name: Alexander Grant. From that night forward, the penthouse no longer felt like a cage. It felt like the edge of something larger, darker, and inescapably magnetic. And though I told myself I was still free, deep down I knew the truth. I had already begun to orbit around the gravity of a man I should have feared more than I could ever admit. The elevator rose through the tower like a silent breath. The lights above the door counted each floor in pale gold, and my reflection stared back from the mirrored wall, calm on the surface, fractured underneath. By now, the routine had become muscle memory. Clock in, enter the penthouse, clean what was already perfect, and pretend I did not feel eyes that lingered on my every move. Yet something had begun to change inside me. The fear that once made my hands tremble had evolved into a sharper awareness, a kind of alertness that felt almost alive. The night began like all the others. The penthouse was immaculate, cold and vast, its windows holding the reflection of a city that glimmered far below. Alexander Grant sat behind his desk, surrounded by muted lamplight, a figure of precise composure. His tie was loosened slightly, a small rebellion that looked more dangerous than any gun. When I entered, he acknowledged me with a glance, before returning to his work. Hours passed in silence, the only sounds the whisper of my cloth against glass and the faint tapping of his pen. Once I caught his reflection in the window, head tilted, eyes narrowed in thought, and realized with an ache of confusion that he looked almost lonely. The thought startled me. Men like him did not get lonely. They ruled loneliness the way kings ruled nations. It was close to midnight when I finished the main rooms and began cleaning the hall outside his office. From within came the murmur of his voice on a call. I did not mean to listen, but the words slipped through the open door like static. "No mistakes," he said, tone low and lethal. "If they touch my shipment again, I want them to remember what fear feels like." The calm in his voice was worse than anger. It carried the weight of finality. I moved away quickly, the realization of his world pressing heavy on my chest. By the time I finished, he was gone, and the penthouse was silent again. I gathered my supplies, double-checked the locks, and stepped into the elevator. Downstairs, the lobby was empty except for the night guard. Ray Johnson nodded as I passed. "Long night?" he asked. "Same as usual," I said. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. Outside, the sky was the color of iron, the air damp and sharp with approaching rain. The streets glistened under the orange wash of the streetlights. I started toward the bus stop, but before I reached it, the heavy doors behind me opened, and laughter spilled out, men's laughter, loud and careless. I turned. 4 men in rumpled suits staggered out of the building, the scent of expensive whiskey clinging to them like cologne. "Well, look what we have here," one of them said when he noticed me. His grin was all teeth, his eyes glassy. "The cleaning staff. Working late, sweetheart?" I tried to step around them, but another blocked my path. "Hey, don't be shy. We just want to talk." His hand reached out, fingers grazing my sleeve. I jerked back, pulse spiking. "Please move," I said, keeping my voice low and even. The leader laughed. "You hear that? She's polite. Come on, honey, we can give you a ride home. Perks of working for the big man upstairs, right?" They circled closer, the smell of alcohol thick in the air. My throat tightened. I looked toward the security desk, but it was empty. The realization hit like a drop of ice. Ray was making his rounds. I took a step back, but one of them caught my wrist. The touch was light, almost playful, but it made something inside me snap. "Let go," I said. The man only laughed again. "Feisty, I like that." Before I could move, a voice cut through the lobby like a blade. "The lady works for me." The sound was unmistakable calm, precise, threaded with steel. Every head turned. Alexander Grant stood near the private elevator, coat draped over his arm, eyes like cold fire. The air in the room shifted instantly. The men's laughter died. "Mr. Grant," the leader stammered, color draining from his face. "We were just leaving," Alexander said. He stepped closer, his expression unreadable. "If I ever see any of you touch what belongs to me again, I will take your hands myself. Do we understand each other?" The words were soft, but the silence that followed was deafening. The men muttered apologies, stumbled for the door, and vanished into the night, their courage dissolving faster than their cologne. For a moment, the only sound was the rain beginning to fall outside, soft against the glass. I stood frozen, heart still racing. Alexander turned to me. "Are you hurt?" No, I managed, though my voice trembled. He studied me for a long moment, eyes searching mine as if confirming the truth. Then he nodded once and gestured toward the private elevator. Come upstairs. I hesitated, but something in his tone left no room for refusal. Inside the elevator, the air felt smaller, charged. He stood beside me, close enough that I could see the faint stubble on his jaw, the clean lines of exhaustion around his eyes. When the doors closed, the hum of the machinery seemed to echo the rhythm of my heartbeat. Why did you help me? I asked finally, unable to bear the silence. He glanced at me, his expression unreadable. I protect what is mine. The words landed like a spark on dry paper. Possession, protection, two sides of the same dangerous coin. I wanted to argue, to tell him I did not belong to anyone, but the look in his eyes stopped me. It was not arrogance, it was certainty, and beneath it, something I could not name. When the elevator opened onto the penthouse, he walked to the window and stared out at the rain. Do you know what people call this city at night? He asked quietly. I shook my head. They call it a mirror. Everything looks beautiful from above, but all it does is reflect whatever darkness you bring into it. He turned back to me, the faintest curve of a smile on his lips. You should be more careful where you walk, Miss Carter. Not every danger will announce itself before it finds you. I met his gaze, the warning sinking into my bones. And you? I asked before I could stop myself. Do you announce yourself? His smile deepened, a flash of something dangerously close to amusement. Only when I choose to be seen. The conversation ended there. He dismissed me with a nod, and I left, heart still unsteady, mind caught between fear and something stranger. Outside, the storm had grown heavier, the wind bending the trees along the street. As I walked toward the bus stop, I realized the world I had stepped into no longer obeyed ordinary rules. Alexander Grant was a storm in a tailored suit, a man who could destroy with a whisper, yet had stepped out of the shadows to protect me. The thought should have terrified me. Instead, it unsettled me in a different way, because some part of me, small and reckless, no longer wanted to run. The rain had not stopped in 3 days. It rolled down the glass walls of Grant Tower like sheets of molten silver, muting the city below into a blur of lights and movement that looked almost unreal. Inside the penthouse, the world existed in another temperature, all quiet steel and controlled order. I arrived early that night, as I always did now, because lateness felt like an invitation for something to go wrong. The air smelled faintly of coffee and antiseptic, a scent that reminded me too much of hospitals. Alexander was not in the main room when I entered. His jacket hung neatly over the back of a chair, a watch lay on the counter, and an unfinished glass of scotch sat near the piano. He had been here recently. The place felt different when he was gone, emptier, as if the gravity that held it together had stepped away for a moment. I unpacked my supplies, moving in deliberate silence, every motion a ritual. The memory of the night in the lobby still followed me, playing back in flashes, the grip on my wrist, the sound of his voice cutting through the air, the way he had said what belongs to me. I told myself it was gratitude I felt, not something else. Gratitude could be rationalized. Anything deeper was a kind of madness I could not afford. The elevator chimed behind me. I turned, expecting him. Instead, a man in a dark suit stepped out, tall and broad, with a look that said he was not here to talk about furniture. His hand rested casually near the inside of his jacket where a weapon would sit. Mr. Grant will not be in tonight, he said, his tone professional. He asked that you finish your work and leave by midnight. I nodded. Of course, and thanks for watching. He gave a short nod in return and disappeared down the corridor. Something about his presence, efficient and cold, sent a shiver down my spine. I kept working, though unease crawled under my skin. Midnight came and went. I checked the clock, wiped the last surface, and reached for my bag. That was when I heard it, a dull sound, like a door slamming too hard somewhere down the hall, followed by a low groan. For a heartbeat, I stood still. Then, instinct, or maybe something worse, moved me forward. I followed the sound toward the study. The door was slightly open. Inside, the lights were off, the only illumination coming from the storm flashing through the windows. I pushed the door wider and froze. Alexander Grant was there, slumped against the sofa, his white shirt soaked with blood. The dark stains spread across his side like ink on paper. His skin was pale, his breathing shallow but steady. The sight rooted me in place. For a second, the world went silent, except for the drum of rain against the glass. I dropped my bag and ran to him. "Mr. Grant," I said, my voice shaking. His eyes opened, unfocused at first, then finding mine. "Stay back," he muttered, voice rough, thick with pain. "You need help." I pressed my hands against the wound, feeling the warm slickness of blood beneath my fingers. "You are bleeding." "It missed anything vital," he said through clenched teeth. "Just a warning from the Kingstons." The name echoed in my mind. I had heard it before, whispered in the corners of his phone calls. "You need a doctor," I said. "No hospitals." His hand shot out, gripping my wrist with surprising strength. "No police, understand?" I nodded, though fear clawed at my chest. "Then you get me something to stop the bleeding," he added. I found the first aid kit in the bathroom and returned to his side. My hands trembled as I cleaned the wound, disinfectant burning my nose. "Hold still," I whispered. He exhaled, the sound closer to a laugh than a groan. "You give orders well, Miss Carter." "Be quiet," I said, pressing gauze to his side. "You will tear the stitches before I even finish." The rain crashed louder outside, thunder vibrating through the glass. His eyes followed me as I worked, their usual coldness dulled by pain. "You should have left when you had the chance," he said softly. "I am not the kind of person who leaves people bleeding," I replied, my voice firmer than I expected, "even when they terrify me." He looked at me then, truly looked, as if seeing something beyond the uniform. "Terrify you? You know what you are," I said quietly. "And yet here I am." Something unreadable passed through his expression, a flicker of regret, maybe even wonder. When the bleeding slowed, I wrapped a bandage tightly around his torso. He leaned back against the sofa, breathing heavily. "They came for me outside a restaurant," he said after a moment, his tone almost conversational. "I thought I had time before the Kingstons would try something. I was wrong." I sank to the floor beside him, exhaustion catching up to me. "Why tell me this?" "Because you deserve to know what danger you are in now," he said. "They saw you with me, and they will assume you matter." The room seemed to shrink around us. "What does that mean?" I whispered. "It means you cannot go home tonight," he said, eyes closing briefly. "You and your brother will stay somewhere safe. I will make arrangements." The casual authority in his tone might have angered me once, but now it only filled me with dread. "And if I refuse?" He opened his eyes again, their gray depths steady. "You will not. You are too smart to die for pride." I wanted to argue, but he was right. I thought of Noah, of his small apartment, of the possibility that men like the one who had shot Alexander might be watching even now. The thought made my blood run cold. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The storm outside eased into a slow drizzle, the sound softer now, almost tender. I checked his pulse, more out of reflex than necessity. "You will live," I said. He smiled faintly, a shadow of his usual composure returning. "You sound disappointed." "I am just surprised," I said. "You seem like someone who does not get lucky often." He laughed, low and rough, then winced at the pain. "You have no idea how wrong you are, Miss Carter." I wanted to ask what he meant, but the exhaustion on his face stopped me. I covered him with a blanket from the couch and sat beside him until his breathing steadied. When he finally drifted into uneasy sleep, I stayed where I was, watching the city lights flicker through the rain. Somewhere below us, life went on. Cars moving through puddles, neon signs blinking over crowded streets, people who would never know the name Alexander Grant or the blood he shed to keep his empire alive. I should have felt relief that he was alive. Instead, I felt something far more dangerous, a pull I could not define, as if saving him had tethered me to him in ways I could no longer undo. When dawn broke, soft and pale against the glass, I realized that fear had stopped being the only reason I stayed. Morning light filtered through the penthouse windows in thin gray ribbons, settling over the marble floors like mist. The storm had passed, but its memory still hung in the air, a quiet heaviness that refused to leave. Alexander was asleep on the sofa, his bandaged side rising and falling in shallow rhythm. I had not slept at all. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the blood again bright against his white shirt, the slow spill of red across my hands, the way he had looked at me when he said they would come for me next. I moved quietly, tidying the room that looked like a crime scene hidden beneath expensive taste. The faint metallic scent of blood still lingered despite the cleaning. When I turned, he was watching me. His eyes were clearer now, though still shadowed by pain. "You are still here," he said, his voice rough. "You were not in any condition to be left alone." He tried to sit up and winced. "You could have left anyway." "I could have," I said, meeting his gaze, "but I did not." Something in his expression softened for a heartbeat before the mask of composure slid back into place. "Then I owe you more than I like owing anyone." "Consider it a professional courtesy," I said, forcing a thin smile. "I do not like cleaning up after corpses." "Not." That earned a quiet laugh that turned into a pained grimace. "You are braver than I thought, Miss Carter. Or just too tired to be afraid anymore." He studied me for a long moment. "Either way, it is time to leave this place. It is no longer safe." Before I could respond, his phone buzzed on the table. He answered it, his tone shifting instantly into authority. "Report." There was a pause, then his expression hardened. "Understood. Secure the perimeter and prepare the transport." He hung up and looked at me. "They know where you live. My men intercepted a message from the Kingstons. You and your brother are targets now." The words struck like a blow. "Noah," I whispered, already reaching for my phone. Alexander was faster. He pressed a number on his own device. "Bring him in," he ordered. "Now." I stared at him. "What does that mean?" "Where is he?" "Safe," he said. "My people are bringing him here. You should pack what you need. You will not be returning to your apartment." "I cannot just disappear," I protested. "Noah has classes, friends." "None of that matters if he is dead," Alexander interrupted, his voice sharp enough to cut through my panic. "The Kingstons are not amateurs. They will not stop until they have leverage." I wanted to argue, to scream, but the image of Alexander bleeding on the sofa silenced me. I nodded once. "Then where are we going?" He stood slowly, leaning on the edge of the couch for balance. "Somewhere they will not reach you." Within an hour, we were in a black SUV with tinted windows, flanked by 2 other vehicles. Noah sat beside me, still half asleep and confused, his backpack clutched like a lifeline. I had tried to explain, but how do you tell someone that the man who signs your paychecks has become the only barrier between you and death? The city gave way to open roads, and soon the skyline disappeared behind us. We drove through miles of forest and winding hills until the trees parted to reveal an estate that looked carved from another century: stone walls, wrought iron gates, guards stationed at every corner. As the gates opened, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. "This is your home," I said quietly. Alexander nodded. "One of them." The mansion was vast, but not ostentatious. Its luxury subdued, the kind that whispered rather than shouted. Inside, the air smelled faintly of wood polish and roses. A woman with kind eyes and silver hair appeared at the top of the staircase. "Alex," she said softly, her voice carrying warmth that no one else had ever used for him. "You are hurt. And even user of—" "Just a scratch, Mother," he replied, his tone gentler than I had ever heard. She descended the steps, her hand brushing his cheek with maternal tenderness. For a moment, he was not the ruthless man I knew, but someone's son. Then her gaze found me and Noah. "And these are people under my protection," Alexander said. "They will be staying in the West Wing." She nodded, the kind of woman who had long since learned not to ask questions that could only end in worry. "I will have rooms prepared." Later, after the introductions and security briefings, I stood by the window of the room assigned to me. It overlooked sprawling gardens dotted with marble statues and a fountain that caught the late afternoon light. From this distance, the estate looked peaceful, untouched by the violence of the city. But beneath that beauty lay something else: control, precision, surveillance. Every corner had cameras. Every door had locks that opened only from certain panels. Noah entered, eyes wide with wonder. "Emma, this place is insane. Did you see the library? It is bigger than our whole apartment." I smiled faintly. "Try not to get used to it." "Are we really safe here?" he asked, his voice small. I hesitated, for now. That night, dinner was served in a room lit by chandeliers that threw soft light across polished wood and crystal. Alexander sat at the head of the table, his posture straight despite the bandage beneath his shirt. Conversation flowed easily between him and his mother, occasionally involving Noah, who seemed delighted by her warmth. I spoke little, preferring to observe. The contrast was staggering. The same man who ordered death in whispered phone calls, now listening patiently to his mother's stories about garden renovations. After dinner, he found me standing by the terrace doors. "You look like you want to run," he said. "I am just not used to being protected," I admitted. "Protection is not always a cage," he said, stepping closer. "Sometimes it is a necessary wall." I turned to face him. "And how long before the wall becomes a prison?" His eyes met mine, steady and unreadable. "That depends on whether you are inside it by choice." I had no answer. We stood there for a long moment, the sound of crickets and distant thunder filling the space between us. For the first time, I noticed the faint lines at the corners of his eyes, the trace of exhaustion that never quite left him. It made him look human. It made everything more complicated. When I finally went to bed, the house was quiet except for the rhythmic ticking of the old clock in the hall. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the events of the past 2 days looping through my mind. My life had become something unrecognizable, a strange mix of safety and captivity, fear and fascination. Somewhere beyond the walls, men with guns guarded the gates. Somewhere in the East Wing, Alexander Grant, the man who had rewritten my fate with a single command, was awake, watching over a world he had built from violence and control. And though I told myself I was only here because I had no choice, a deeper truth whispered beneath the surface. I was no longer sure I wanted to leave. The third night in the Grant estate was too quiet. Even the wind outside seemed to move with caution, threading through the trees that guarded the property like sentinels. I had grown used to the distant hum of the city, the sound of traffic and human life, but here the silence was complete, heavy, watchful, unnatural. Every corridor gleamed with the perfection of money and control. Even the air smelled curated, faintly of cedar and roses. Yet beneath the luxury ran an invisible current of tension that made my skin prickle. Noah adapted quickly, as I expected. He spent his days in the library, his evenings at dinner with Alexander's mother, his mind already chasing new projects and possibilities. Watching him smile in this place filled me with a strange mixture of relief and guilt. He deserved safety. He deserved a life untouched by men like Alexander Grant. But safety that belonged to someone else's empire could crumble at a moment's notice. I moved through the hallways late that night, unable to sleep. The storm had passed, leaving behind a calm so complete it felt staged. I wandered to the terrace that overlooked the gardens. The moonlight fell across the marble fountain, and for a moment the place looked almost serene. I wanted to believe it. Footsteps sounded behind me. I turned and saw Alexander. He wore no suit jacket, just a black shirt open at the throat, sleeves rolled to his elbows. The sight was disarming. The air between us shifted, charged. "You do not rest," he said, his tone low, more observation than reprimand. "I could say the same," I replied. He came to stand beside me, looking out at the gardens. "The Kingstons attacked one of our warehouses tonight," he said, his voice calm but edged. "They are getting bold." "And you think they will come here?" I asked. "I think they will try anything that makes me bleed." His eyes met mine briefly. "Which is why I am increasing security." "It's Mary Hat," Something in the way he said it, possessive, protective, absolute, made it hard to breathe. You cannot control everything, I said softly. He gave a short, humorless smile. You sound like my sister used to. That surprised me. You have a sister? 3, he said. 2 live abroad now. 1 no longer does. The pause in his voice carried a weight words could not hold. I am sorry, I said quietly. He turned his gaze back to the night. The Kingstons took her. Years ago. That is why this will never end until one of us is gone. There was nothing to say to that. The silence stretched between us, filled with everything neither of us could fix. A sound broke the quiet, distant at first, then sharper. A muffled shout. Then another. Alexander's posture changed instantly, the calm replaced by lethal focus. Stay here, he ordered, already moving. What is happening? I called after him, but he was gone. An alarm erupted through the estate, a low wail that vibrated in the bones. The lights in the hallway shifted to red emergency glow. I ran back inside, searching for Noah, panic clawing up my throat. The house that had seemed serene moments ago now felt like a maze of danger. I found him near the staircase, wide-eyed and frightened. Stay behind me, I said, grabbing his arm. We have to find Alexander. Gunfire cracked from outside, muffled by distance and walls. My heart hammered as we moved through the hallways. Rounding a corner, I saw Alexander ahead, flanked by 2 men in tactical gear. He was shouting orders, every word sharp and certain. They breached the south perimeter, 1 guard reported. Lock down the west wing, Alexander commanded. No one gets through. His eyes caught mine then, narrowing. What are you doing here? You should have stayed in your room. I was not going to hide while people are dying, I said, breathless. This is not your fight. Maybe not, I said, stepping closer, but you made it my life. He froze for a moment, as if the truth in that sentence had landed harder than any bullet. Then he cursed under his breath and pulled me toward a side corridor. This way. We moved quickly, his hand gripping mine with a force that left no argument. The air smelled of smoke and gunpowder. Somewhere nearby, a window shattered. I heard the echo of boots on stone too close. He turned sharply into a narrow hallway that led to the control room. As he reached for the door, a flicker of movement caught my eye, a shadow at the far end, raising a gun. Alexander! I shouted. He spun, but I was already moving. I threw myself against him, shoving him sideways just as the gunfire erupted. The bullets tore through the wall where he had been standing. He grabbed me, pulling me down behind the heavy desk as more shots rang out. Are you out of your mind? He hissed, pressing a gun into his hand. Apparently, I said, my pulse racing. He fired once, twice. Silence followed. The air reeked of cordite. Somewhere outside, the sound of engines receded into the night. The attack had been fast and precise, a warning, not a siege. When the guards confirmed the perimeter was secure, Alexander turned to me. His face was pale, eyes burning with something between anger and fear. You could have been killed. So could you? I said. You were about to walk straight into that. He stared at me for a long time, then exhaled slowly. You saved my life. Consider us even, I said, though my voice shook. He reached up, brushing a stray lock of hair from my face. The gesture was unexpected, intimate. Do you have any idea what you just did? I kept you alive, I said. His hand lingered for a heartbeat before he pulled it back. You make everything more complicated, Miss Carter. It's what? Maybe that is what you need. The corner of his mouth curved faintly. Careful. You are starting to sound like someone who belongs here. The words made something twist in my chest. Fear, longing, I could not tell. Outside, the first light of dawn was beginning to break over the estate, turning the wet grass silver. The guards dispersed, the alarm silenced, the house returning to its deceptive calm. Alexander looked out at the fading night, his profile etched against the glow. This ends soon, he said quietly, almost to himself, one way or another. I watched him, realizing that somewhere between fear and defiance, I had crossed a line I could never retreat from. I had saved the life of a man who terrified me, and in doing so, bound myself to him in a way neither of us could undo. When he turned back to me, his voice was softer. You should rest. We will talk in the morning. But I knew that whatever conversation awaited us would not be about safety. It would be about choices and the price of staying in a world that had already decided I was part of it. That night, as I lay awake, listening to the distant hum of generators and guards' footsteps outside, one truth settled deep inside me. I was no longer just a witness to Alexander Grant's world. I was now a part of it, written into its story in blood and consequence. Dawn crept slowly over the Grant estate, painting the stone walls in a soft gold that felt undeserved after a night soaked in gunfire. I stood by the window of my room, watching the light chase away the shadows that had haunted the gardens. The world outside looked deceptively peaceful. Birds moved through the trees, the fountain glittered, and somewhere beyond the hills the city began its daily rhythm. Yet the silence here was the kind that followed a storm, a silence that waited for what would happen next. The events of the night replayed in my head in fragments. The alarm, the shots, Alexander's voice shouting orders, the feel of his hand pulling me out of the line of fire. The smell of smoke and fear that clung to the hallways. I had not been able to sleep after that. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the flash of the gun aimed at him, heard again the sound of the bullet slicing through the air before I shoved him aside. It should have terrified me. Instead, it left me hollow, restless, aware that I had crossed a line I could never step back from. A knock at the door pulled me from my thoughts. When I opened it, one of Alexander's guards stood there, a tall man with the kind of expression that gave nothing away. Mr. Grant would like to see you, he said. My stomach tightened, but I nodded. Where? His study. The walk through the halls felt longer than usual. The air still carried the faint metallic scent of gunpowder. 2 guards stood outside the study doors. They stepped aside as I entered. Alexander was there, standing by the window with his hands clasped behind his back. He wore a charcoal suit, the bandage beneath his shirt barely visible. The room was bathed in soft morning light, the shadows of the blinds cutting across the floor like bars. When he turned to face me, his expression was unreadable. You wanted to see me, I said. He nodded once. Sit. I obeyed, though my pulse quickened. He studied me for a long moment, then said quietly, You saved my life last night. You would have done the same, I replied automatically. A ghost of a smile touched his mouth. I am not sure I would have, he said. At least, not once. I frowned. Is that supposed to make me feel better? It is supposed to make you understand what that means here. He came around the desk, standing close enough that I could smell the faint scent of his cologne, clean, restrained, precise. You changed the balance, Emma. When you act in a world like mine, there are consequences. Whether you meant to or not, you chose a side. I did what anyone would have done. I said, though the lie tasted bitter. Anyone? His voice softened, dangerously quiet. Most people would have frozen. You moved. He studied me, eyes narrowing slightly. You are not ordinary, no matter how hard you try to be. The words made my breath catch. I am not part of this world, I said firmly. I never asked to be. And yet you are, he said simply, which is why I am offering you a choice. He moved back behind his desk, opened a drawer, and placed a small folder on the surface between us. You can leave, he said. There is money in this folder, enough to start a new life. Different name, different city. You and your brother will be protected until you disappear. I stared at the folder. And the other option? He leaned forward, elbows on the desk, his gaze locked on mine. You stay under my protection. You work for the legitimate side of my business, the charity division, the foundation. I will see to your education, your future, your brother's as well. But if you stay knowing what I am and what that means. For a long moment, the only sound was the ticking of the clock on the wall. The choice sat between us like a loaded weapon. Leave and vanish. Stay and surrender. What would happen if I left? I asked quietly. He hesitated. You would survive, he said, but you would always be looking over your shoulder. And if I stay? His expression softened just slightly. Then I am the one who will be looking over it for you. I wanted to hate the calm certainty in his voice, but it carried something I had not expected: honesty. He was giving me the truth as he knew it, stripped of illusion. I cannot decide this now, I said finally. You have until tomorrow, he said. After that, I make the decision for you. Anger flared in me. You cannot control every choice I make. Do not mistake control for protection, he said. They often look the same, but they are not. I stood, my hands trembling. You do not know what protection is. You build walls and call them safety, but they are prisons. His eyes met mine, sharp and unflinching. And you are free out there, working 2 jobs, drowning in debt, living one step from collapse? That is not freedom, Emma. That is slow death. The word struck too close to the truth. I wanted to argue, but he was right, and he knew it. He stepped closer, his voice quieter now. I am not asking you to love this world. I am asking you to survive in it. When I left the study, the corridor felt too bright, too empty. I walked through the house without direction, my thoughts colliding in every direction at once. Outside, Noah sat on the terrace with a laptop, completely absorbed in his work. He looked peaceful, happy in a way I had not seen in years. For him, this place was opportunity. For me, it was a trap disguised as salvation. That night, I could not eat. I sat in my room long after midnight, the folder on the table before me. Inside were stacks of cash, identification documents with names I did not recognize, and 2 plane tickets. I traced my finger over the names, the future I could have if I just walked away. But then I thought of Noah, his laughter at dinner, the sparkle in his eyes when he talked about the technology he was helping develop for Alexander's company. He had found something here, a purpose that I could not take from him. When the clock struck 2, I stood and opened the window. The night air was cool and smelled faintly of rain. Somewhere in the east wing, a light still glowed behind the window of Alexander's office. He was awake, as always, guarding his empire, planning his next move. I thought of his words. I am not asking you to love this world. I am asking you to survive in it. For so long, survival had been the only thing I knew how to do. Maybe, I thought, survival could look like something else now. Maybe it could look like choice. When I closed the window, I already knew my answer. I would not run. Not again. Tomorrow I would tell Alexander Grant that I was staying but on my own terms, and whether he realized it or not, that choice would make me as dangerous as him. 6 months passed, and the world I once knew faded into something that belonged to someone else. The Grant estate no longer felt like a fortress. It felt like a city contained within walls, alive with its own pulse. Outside those gates, the world spun on sirens, headlines, traffic, but inside, life moved in quiet, deliberate rhythm. I had taken Alexander's offer. I told myself it was for Noah, but deep down I knew it was for more than that. Now I worked in the heart of the city again, though under very different circumstances. My badge no longer read cleaning staff. It read Director, Grant Charitable Foundation. My office sat on the 32nd floor of Grant Tower, high enough to see the skyline but low enough to still feel human. My days were filled with numbers, projects, and decisions that touched lives I would never meet. Scholarships for underprivileged students, housing grants, disaster relief funds. I used to clean floors for men like this. Now I signed papers that changed the direction of lives. Sometimes I caught my reflection in the office glass and barely recognized the woman staring back. The same dark eyes, the same determined mouth, but the posture was different. The weight that once bent my shoulders had become something steadier, stronger. I had learned how to hold my head high even when I walked past men in suits who once would not have looked at me at all. Noah had grown into his own life as well. He now worked in the technology division of Grant Industries, developing programs that made the company's public face gleam with innovation. His excitement when he spoke about his work was infectious. I had not seen him this happy since before the fire that took our parents. For him, this was everything we had dreamed of: security, opportunity, a future. For me, it was more complicated, because behind every legitimate document and polished presentation lay the shadow of Alexander Grant. I saw him almost every evening. Our schedules had synchronized into something neither of us had planned. He would appear at the door of my office just as I finished the last of my reports, his presence filling the room with quiet command. "You work too late," he would say, and I would reply, "So do you." Then we would leave together, descending the same elevator that once carried me down in fear. He had changed too, though not in ways the world could see. To his board of directors, he was still the ruthless CEO with a vision that never faltered. To the newspapers, he was the philanthropic businessman who rebuilt communities, but in the private hours I had glimpsed something else: tiredness that edged his movements, a solitude that even power could not erase. Some nights, after a long day of meetings, I would still clean his private office. He had insisted on keeping the ritual, saying he trusted no one else with that space. At first, I thought it was control. Later, I realized it was something quieter, an acknowledgement of the night our paths had crossed. While I wiped the polished desk and adjusted the files, he would stand by the window, speaking in low tones to someone on the phone, words like shipment and contract slipping between conversations about charity and business. The two sides of his world existed in perfect balance, each feeding the other, each depending on my silence. One evening, as the sun bled into the skyline, painting the glass in shades of gold and crimson, Alexander entered the office without his usual precision. His tie was gone, his sleeves rolled to the elbows, and the faint shadow of stubble darkened his jaw. "Another long day?" I asked. "They are all long," he said, dropping into the chair behind his desk. His voice was tired, but his eyes were as sharp as ever. "You have a meeting with the university board tomorrow. The new scholarship fund is ready." "I know," I said, sitting across from him. "You read every report I send." "Old habits," he said with a faint smile. "Control is a difficult thing to unlearn." "It is also a lonely one," I replied before I could stop myself. His gaze met mine. "And yet you understand it better than most." The silence stretched between us. There was nothing romantic in the way he looked at me, not exactly. It was something heavier, built on mutual recognition. We were two people who had been shaped by survival, molded by loss, forged in necessity. In another life, we might have been enemies or nothing at all. Finally, he stood. "Come with me," he said. "To where?" "Home." The word caught in my chest. Home. The estate no longer felt foreign. The hallways that once seemed like cages now carried the echo of laughter, the smell of food, the warmth of something that almost resembled peace. That evening, dinner was quiet. Alexander's mother spoke softly about her roses. Noah talked about a new design he was working on. Alexander listened more than he spoke, his attention drawn occasionally to the band of light that slipped through the window and touched the edge of his glass. He looked at peace, almost human, and it frightened me how much that comforted me. Later, when the others had gone to bed, I walked out to the garden. The air was cool and sweet with the scent of rain-wet grass. I heard his footsteps before I saw him. "You always find the quiet places," he said, joining me. "They are the only places where I can think," I replied. He nodded. "Do you regret staying?" The question caught me off guard. I turned to him, searching his face for the meaning behind it. "No," I said finally, "but I think about what it cost." His expression softened. "Everything has a cost, Emma. The difference is that now you are the one choosing what to pay." Ender the haddock way. We stood there in silence, the moonlight tracing silver lines through the garden. There was a kind of peace in that moment, fragile and fleeting, the kind that exists only between storms. As we turned back toward the house, he said quietly, "I told you once that protection and control are not the same. I am still learning the difference." "And what have you learned?" I asked. He hesitated. "That sometimes the only way to protect something is to let it stand beside you instead of behind you." The words lingered in the air between us, simple but heavy with meaning. For the first time, I understood what he was offering, not ownership, not possession, but something closer to trust. When I went to bed that night, I looked at the city lights flickering beyond the hills and realized that my life had found a strange balance between darkness and grace. I was no longer invisible, no longer afraid, and no longer certain where the line between freedom and belonging began or ended. All I knew was that in this new world of glass towers and quiet power, Alexander Grant and I had stopped being enemies and had become something far more dangerous, two people who understood each other completely. Night always seemed different from the top floor of Grant Tower. The city below glimmered like a constellation, 1,000 tiny lights breathing in rhythm with the pulse of life. I stood near the window of Alexander's office, the same one where, months ago, I had first seen him, the man I feared, the man whose shadow had swallowed my world. Now, the reflection staring back at me in the glass looked older, steadier, marked by every choice that had brought me here. The office was quiet except for the distant hum of the city and the ticking of the antique clock that never seemed to stop. Papers lay neatly stacked on his desk, beside a crystal glass half filled with scotch. I was wiping down the polished surface, the same way I always did at the end of the day. It was a ritual neither of us had ever questioned. The simple rhythm of cloth against wood grounded me, a reminder that no matter how much had changed, some things remained constant. The elevator chimed softly behind me. I did not have to turn to know who it was. His presence always altered the air, shifting it from stillness to awareness. "You are still working," Alexander said, his voice smooth and calm, the same tone that once terrified me. "You are still awake," I replied without looking up. "I could say the same," he said, stepping closer. The sound of his footsteps was slow, deliberate, the sound of someone who was never rushed by the world around him. I finished the last corner of the desk before turning to face him. He had removed his jacket, his tie undone, the top buttons of his shirt open. The lines of fatigue around his eyes made him look less like a king and more like a man who had been fighting wars no one else could see. "The board meeting went late," he said, setting a folder on the desk. "But it was a success. The new contracts will keep our people busy for months." "I read the reports," I said. "The foundation's funding will increase again." He nodded. "Thanks to you." I shook my head. "Thanks to your name." He studied me for a moment, his expression unreadable. "You still do not take credit well." "Maybe because I remember what it felt like to clean these floors instead of walking on them," I said quietly. His gaze softened. "And yet you stood in both worlds and never let either destroy you." Azurglis. The compliment hung in the air between us, too heavy for either of us to hold comfortably. I turned back to the window, watching the reflection of the city lights ripple across the glass. "It feels strange," I admitted. "Everything I used to want, I have now. Security, purpose, stability. But sometimes I wonder if I traded one kind of cage for another." "You are not a prisoner here, Emma," he said gently. "Aren't I?" I asked, turning to face him again. "You saved me, yes, but you also built the walls that keep me here. I work for your company, I live in your house, I breathe your world. How much of my life is really mine?" He walked to the window, standing beside me. "All of it," he said softly. "You made your choices. You stayed when you could have left. You built something out of the chaos I gave you. That was never my doing." I looked up at him, searching for deception and finding none. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The city glowed between us like a witness to every word left unsaid. "Why did you keep me here?" I finally asked. "After everything, you could have let me go." He hesitated, then said, "Because I could not forget the woman who stood in my office and told me she did not want to be afraid. I saw something in you that I lost a long time ago, hope. And somehow every time I look at you, I start to believe in it again." The confession unraveled something inside me. "You are still a dangerous man, Alexander." He smiled faintly. "And you are still not afraid of me." "I am," I said. but not in the way I used to be. He turned toward me then, the distance between us narrowing to a breath. When I first met you, he said quietly, you were invisible to everyone. You walked through this building like a ghost, unseen, unheard, surviving on nothing but willpower. Now, when you enter a room, people notice. You have changed this place more than I ever did. The sincerity in his tone disarmed me more than any charm could. I searched his face, the sharp lines softened by light, the blue-gray eyes that once froze me, now holding warmth that was almost impossible to believe. What happens now? I asked. He reached out slowly, his hand brushing mine. Now, he said, we stop pretending that survival is enough. The touch was light, deliberate, but it carried the weight of everything we had endured, fear, defiance, loss, and something else that had grown quietly in the spaces between. The clock ticked once, loud in the silence. He leaned closer, his voice barely above a whisper. I protect what matters to me, he said, and that has become you. The words settled in the air like a promise and a warning all at once. I felt their truth before I could speak it. I had spent months convincing myself that what bound us was circumstance, that gratitude was not love, that proximity was not trust. But as I looked into his eyes, I knew that whatever name I gave it, it was real, and it had already rewritten both of us. Outside, the city stretched endlessly, lights flickering like constellations we would never reach. For the first time in years, I was not running. I was standing exactly where I had chosen to be. He released my hand, stepping back, his composure returning like armor. You should go home, he said quietly. It is late. I nodded, but neither of us moved. The silence felt different now, full instead of empty. Finally, I said, home is not a place anymore, Alexander. It is the people we survive with. A rare smile touched his lips, slow and genuine. Then perhaps we finally understand each other. I left the office that night knowing that whatever tomorrow held power, danger, or peace, it would no longer be his world or mine alone. It would be ours, bound not by fear, but by choice. And as the elevator doors closed behind me, I realized that the woman who had once swept these floors had become something entirely new, not invisible, not untouchable, but alive, fierce, and finally seen.